I wanted to have a discussion about some of the issues about crop nutrition, and I want to preface, a lot of this will lead into the stuff that James is going to talk about, James Hunt will talk about next, but I think the key message is about there is no free lunch with nutrition. You just got to keep at it. You've got to replace what you... oh, there's the right button. Forward. Okay, so we're talking about outlook, planning, looking back and planning ahead. You can always look back, but you've got to look forward too. Looking back tells you what you've done wrong or done right, but really you've got to take that on board. A very wet 2022, what does that help us think about coming into 2023? And I want to talk particularly about nitrogen and phosphorus processes and outcomes. Maybe a little note on some areas that might have been flooded, and certainly I saw quite a lot of ducks on the side of the road coming up too, so I don't know whether nobody's going to shoot them this year, I don't think, but and some conclusions. And if you want to go to sleep now, there's some good jokes coming up, but if you want to go to sleep, basically soil testing is your best worst strategy or your worst best strategy going forward. Every year presents new challenges. We remember 2016, a wet early August, September, ended up very good year. That's not a black snake, that's an eel in a canola crop. So, very different situation compared to this year, which was a little wet a little later. And as a result, we ended up with fantastic pictures of green headers and red headers and all sorts of headers bogged and spray equipment. That one on the right, the red, is up at Merriwagga, up in New South Wales. I had to get it out with well, you can see what they had to get it out with. But that's the sort of situation, the lessons we can take from that is that, you have to... Experience isn't what happens to you, it's what you think and what you do with what's happened. It's how you interpret what happens and take it forward. The thing you'd take forward from that is to make sure you mapped out where the old channels and dams were for the next wet year. There is an obvious upside to a wet year, and that is it's wet. And there's stored water. If you look on the Extension Oz soil moisture mapping website, you can see that the blue dots represent situations where there's 75 to 100% stored water to the top. I think it's 150 centimetres. So and the red is lower, but if you pick up a few of those, there's places like Werribee, Speed, Brim, Raywood, etc. Even Normanville has 100%. Birchip and Banjarang, 75 to 100, but still the point is that there is stored water there. And that 100 mil, 150 mil of stored water is 2 to 3 tonne of grain that you have the capacity to exploit that water. And I think with nutrition, disease management, that's the concept you should have. You've got a resource there. There are some places like Lawloit, that's a lucerne paddock. And you can see that the lucerne has depleted that water. So that's been used, but it's been used effectively. I think and aside from nutrition, but it does tie into it, is that if you've got that resource, don't lose it with poor summer weed control. And this is some data from central New South Wales, from New South Wales, looking at weed control, no sprays, delayed sprays, etc., on terms of stored water and mineral nitrogen. And the take-home message is that good summer weed control in that situation gave 0.8 tonnes per hectare, which came as a consequence of 60 mil of preserved water and 50 kilograms of extra nitrogen. So, use it, but you lose it if you don't control it. So they're the things that have changed. What hasn't changed? Well, the first thing that hasn't changed is there's no such thing as a free lunch. If produce goes out the gate, it takes nutrients with it. It's not like the magic pudding that you cut a slice out of it and suddenly that material comes back and reappears. It's just a principle of mass balance. And the amount that goes out the gate determines how much you need to come in through the gate. So a 5-tonne wheat crop, for example, 100 kilograms of nitrogen will go out, 15 kilograms of P, 18 kilograms of K. To replace it, is looking at 75 kilograms of MAP and 200 of urea. So with a hay crop, a 3-tonne hay crop, for example, 25 of MAP, 100 kilograms. Now that's not the defining way to set your fertiliser program, but it gives you an idea over time of what's happening in your paddock. And this is an example, thanks very much to the guys at Nutrient in Donald who have supplied these data, and we've presented these a couple of times, so you always get a good example and you flog it to death. But in this example, this is a paddock at Banjarang over 4 years with phosphorus rate. A couple of good years, a 4-tonne vetch crop, barley, hay, nearly 10 tonne, 2.5 tonne canola and a 5-tonne wheat crop. Now the guy was actually using higher rates than that, but at 50 kilograms of MAP, the P balance over that period was a negative 18 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare. So what that guy's doing in terms of his or her phosphorus balance is running down that resource. And the MAP rate to balance that over that time was about 80 kilograms a hectare. So if you've got that picture in your mind of what is being removed, you can sort of adjust where you are in terms of what you need to supply. And the consequence of that declining phosphorus reserve, thanks to Chris Dixon, who provided this photo, is this is a strip that didn't have phosphorus compared to a P strip in that paddock. So it's pretty visual. And I recommend to you, if you're not convinced that the phosphorus has any value to you, just turn the phosphorus drive off, turn the super drive off on your machine for half a round or a strip, and get an idea of really how you're going. We looked at some of these nutrient balances over time. We did a project with GRDC we looked at about 600 paddocks across southeastern Australia, 4 to 5 years of data, and we looked at in rotation what's happening in these paddocks, what's happening in terms of nutrient supply and nutrient removal. This is a data we collected from the Mallee, and many of you contributed to this, and we thank that Birchip was involved in helping us collect this data. But what we found is 2 out of 3 paddocks over that 5-year period, which was, I think, basically 9 to 13, 2009, 2013, had more phosphorus added than removed. So what was happening in the Mallee in that situation was that there was more nutrient, higher phosphorus inputs than removal. So phosphorus status would have been building up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but that's just how it is. That those 4 or 5 years probably are different to the last 4 or 5 years. And the last 4 or 5 years probably, it may be 1 out of 3 paddocks only is in phosphorus surplus. We don't know. You need to do the numbers yourself. We know that in the long term, managing that phosphorus balance can help us, understand where we're going. This is from an experiment that Incitec Pivot worked on with myself over 15 years or 17 years, looking at 3 different rates of phosphorus. Well, there's other rates, but there's green line, the blue line is no phosphorus, and the coal P started off at 24, ended up at 17. the line trend is the trend is actually what is the phosphorus balance. So over that period, that took out about 130 kilograms of phosphorus out of that plot area. Where we had 9 kilograms of phosphorus, the balance was about 40 kilograms over that period. And the Colwell P ended up about 40. Where we had 18 kilograms of phosphorus, we didn't actually lose the phosphorus, it was still there, but it showed up mainly in the soil test. So there was no point putting on 18 kilograms. And in that period of time, that was, of course, included the Millennium Drought, that was 9 to 10 kilograms of P was about a P balance figure, which maintained our soil fertility. To understand where that spot in the map is, we do use soil tests. Now, soil tests don't tell you how much fertiliser to use. Soil tests tell you where you are in the system relating to soil fertility overall. They'll give you a critical value and a maintenance value, an economic optimum. I don't think that really has any real meaning, an economic optimum. Ask me later why, but what it tells you what your status is, low to high. And that gives you a set of, and that gives you a set of options about what you do, whether you build, balance or bring down the phosphorus status or any nutrient status. If you're in balance, removals plus losses, so a 6-tonne wheat crop might need 22 kilograms of P to maintain the soil test value. If you're building, you might need to add an extra 2 or 3 kilograms to raise a Colwell P 1 unit. That depends on the PBI, the phosphorus buffering index, so that if you wanted to build soil test values with that same wheat crop, you might need 25 kilos and build that up over time. You might think if the soil test is very high, you might want to bring it down. And certainly you can operate in a P deficit over time, that is, where removal is more than application, because you have those soil P reserves there. And the only qualifier I put is that we've always found having some P in the starter row is beneficial in terms of crop yield, even at high soil P tests. So, build, balance or bring down is the strategy that you can use, that you can think about. So in terms of into 2023 for phosphorus, knowing the soil phosphorus status and managing around that critical value. If it's above the critical value, you can reduce P input. If it's below the critical value, you'll need to build, so you might need more than removal. You can lower it in the short term, but no free lunch. You'll have to rebuild it over time when fertilisers get cheaper. That's not going to happen, is it? You just should be grateful that your fathers and your grandfathers used a big bag of superphosphate per acre per year, every crop they grew, and that's where your phosphorus balances come from. So the second, that's a bit about phosphorus. So what hasn't changed? Number 2, we need to know what the limiting factor is. It's no good checking the hydraulic oil in the John Deere there. It's not going to make it go any better. In agriculture, in this situation, this is from that long-term experiment, 20N, no P, 80N, no P. Your limiting factor is not nitrogen. Limiting factor clearly, well, not clearly, the limiting factor in that situation was phosphorus. So we had to address the phosphorus status. If we go back to the data set we had from the Mallee and we looked at nitrogen as well, remember we said that 2 out of 3 paddocks were in phosphorus surplus. Well, 2 out of 3 paddocks that we looked at were in nitrogen deficit. That is, 2 out of 3 paddocks were taking more nitrogen away, and that includes fixed nitrogen, than was being supplied. And the consequence of that is your nitrogen fertility is going down, and the soil organic source of nitrogen is also declining. That nitrogen is not for free, it comes from organic reserves. So I think that's one of the conclusions we had from that data, was that maybe you should think about moving resources from phosphorus into nitrogen in this situation. And that's a decision you'd need to make on the basis of soil test values. Going into this season, we're really in a situation where we're on swings and roundabouts with nitrogen. We know that we've got nitrogen additions with mineralisation and fixation and fertilisers that we put in. We've got removals, and there's several processes other than removal in the grain that are operating now in your paddocks and have been operating in your paddocks, relating to the losses and the transformations of nitrogen. We've got immobilisation, denitrification, leaching and burning. I just want to pick on a couple of those things. I don't want to go into the detail too much, but to understand that mineralisation is the process which exploits soil organic nitrogen. It's not free, it's organic nitrogen that's being transformed into ammonia, which then becomes nitrified. It's biological and it's very seasonal. Wet soils, moist soils, 20 degrees, mineralisation will be running along, and that's what's happening in your paddock now. Depends how much organic material is. 0.5 kilogram of nitrogen mineralised per millimetre of rain after legumes. Rules of thumb. That's not the only thing that happens though. We also get nitrogen fixation. And legumes ain't legumes, as we know. Legumes fix nitrogen at different rates. Beans, and that fixation is very much related to the biomass that they're produced. Rule of thumb again, 20 to 30 kilograms of N fixed per tonne of biomass grown. So that if you've got a lentil crop that's got 3 or 4 tonne of biomass, that's probably fixed 80 kilograms of N. But if that lentil crop yields 3 tonnes, God forbid that would happen, that yield will take out 90 to 100 kilograms of nitrogen. So that crop's in nitrogen deficit. So, it's all very well thinking about the amount that's fixed, and this is some examples here of the kilograms, but in fact you've also got depletion and removal. The other major process that happened over the spring and into the summer is denitrification, and that's the loss of nitrogen as it turns to nitrogen, dinitrogen and nitrous oxide. And that's because the bugs in the soil want to pinch that oxygen off the nitrate that's there and use it for their own purposes. Where there's and the amounts that can be lost are staggering. This is again some measurements from that wet spring in New South Wales. 2nd of September, by the 2nd of September, there was 134 kilograms of nitrogen in that profile, ammonium and nitrate nitrogen. 1 month later, 2/3 of that had disappeared. Well, they hadn't disappeared. Conservation of mass says it was there, but it was actually either leached below the sampling area or more likely denitrified into dinitrogen gas, nitrous oxide or nitric oxide. 100 kilograms, 80 to 100 kilograms can disappear with waterlogging when the soils are warm. Not necessarily when they're cold, but when they're warm, and that's the situation. We also get the issue with nitrogen being tied up. And the importance of that process is that if you've got your 6-tonne wheat crop, the stubble from that 6-tonne wheat crop will immobilise 60 to 70 kilograms of nitrogen. Now that hasn't disappeared, and you may get it back next year, but the point is that in the short term you've had this process of mineralisation occurring, but you've also had immobilisation and you've also had denitrification, and so the balance of those processes becomes pretty uncertain when we think about what that means. We also think about burning losses. burning stubble will lose about 80% of the nitrogen. And that doesn't mean that nitrogen is present in the ash that comes from your neighbour's place and drops on your field. That occurs as nitrogen, as dinitrogen, as ammonia gas, which eventually might turn into nitrate somewhere else. But the point is that 80% of that nitrogen that was in the straw, if you burn your stubble, will be lost. If you keep it there, it'll be immobilised. So, you know, that's where the swings and roundabouts come about. You'll definitely lose it if you burn it. You might lose it for a little while if you retain it. Very few people will be burning anyway. Kelly sent me I was discussing with her about this issue about what's the status of paddocks, and she provided me with some data from a paddock that had 3 areas: good growth, flooded late, no yield; poor growth, no yield; and good growth with good yield. And we just looked at the profile ends and the profile waters in those two zones. And the thing about this is that certainly where there was good growth, there was quite a bit more water, quite a bit more nitrogen. One of the things about the nitrogen in both those situations where the flooding occurs was that quite a high proportion of the nitrogen is present as ammonium, which then has to be converted to nitrate. And that's not always a quick process. It can get bound up. But the point there is that the lentils, even across that paddock, the nitrogen status was pretty variable and the water status was variable. I was surprised how little variability there was in the water status across those paddocks. Just shows lentils don't use much water, I suppose. Putting that into a package for 2023, paddocks are going to be highly variable across the landscape, between paddocks, within paddocks. Denitrification in the wetter parts, high removal in the drier parts. That sort of brings the issue down about your deep soil ends, getting deep soil ends done. And sulphur at the same time, because sulphur and nitrogen behave essentially the same. They'll get leached. Sulphur won't get desulfurised, but it will leach and enter organic pools as well. So consider sampling by zones and sampling with a stratified sample as well. And you might also consider an enriched strip. I think I've been using the enriched strip term for maybe 25 years, and I'm sure at least one farmer's done it by now, so that's my effectiveness. Enriched strips really are just a strip of extra nitrogen across the paddock. It won't tell you exactly what to do with your nitrogen, but what it will tell you is whether or not you need any more. And that's the point that Mark Branson's always made about it. Mark Branson from South Australia. He says it gives me confidence if I don't have to apply it. So, you know, it's not rocket surgery or brain science. It's just a very straightforward strategy about getting some more information on your paddock. The third thing that hasn't changed is that there are no silver bullets in terms of crop nutrition. There's no new nutrient that we've discovered that will solve everybody's problems. There's no microbe that will provide free phosphorus and nitrogen and sulphur. There's nothing that will meet every situation. There are situations where zinc, for example, in our region, very important. Other micronutrients are also important. In some situations we're seeing various trace elements and various nutrients and even some microbial supplements having an effect, but it's horses for courses. And if you've got Winks as your horse, you've got a good horse for that course, for most courses, but we don't have Winks. And you know, the story is, if a deal's too good to be true, and it usually is. So the summary for that is that soil tests, you need to know where you are. 2023 is a new year, new set of challenges. remember what happens. Ian's told us we're going to have frosts, so we're buggered anyway. But the good thing about frosts is at least the nutrients won't go out of the paddock. So whack them on. Offtakes of nutrients have been high, including pulses. Look at that P offtake and get balances. Mobile nutrients are likely to be leached, and that's nitrogen and sulphur. Soil nitrogen status is highly variable, going to be highly variable again. You might need more N at seeding. I saw some paddocks in the soil tests when we had some discussions with the nutrient guys, that there were paddocks that had no topsoil nitrate, just been leached away. And not everything's explainable, but most things are. But the important thing is not to stop questioning. And the final point, John, is about what to do with those flooded areas. This is just a final dot point. There are areas where you might have 20 acres or 30 acres or 40 acres that has been flooded. Don't particularly worry about it, because the Nile, the Egyptian farmers used to flood their soils every year to grow crops, and they did that for millennia. The issues might be that some cases that might be sodic, some gypsum might be useful, it might be crusted, sodic, and maybe some cultivation. You might think about kickstarting biology. You're wasting water though, probably. You have good subsoil moisture. Try and exploit that subsoil moisture, but the nitrogen is likely to be low. So with that, John, I'd just like to finish there. And theory and practice don't always go together.
Thanks, Rob, for a great informative talk and presentation. So I'll take questions firstly from the audience, but just to note, those people who are putting questions up that didn't get answered on Slido, our staff in conjunction with the presenter will be answering those unanswered questions in the coming days. So questions from the audience for a start? Rob, well, we might go to the questions on notice. Have we got someone up the back there?
On the screen?
On the screen, yeah. I've noticed that the examples of phosphorus soil analysis you used were coal wool as opposed to DGTP. Could you please give your opinion on those two soil tests?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what soil test you've got. DGT is useful. Coal wool has been more rigorously evaluated and is found to be the test at which DGT is compared. So DGT has some supporters. Simon in the room? He's not here? No, it's good. I can say whatever we want.
He's watching.
He's watching. I think DGT is an option. I would still prefer to have a coal wool with a PBI to help me interpret that, because I think the interpretation of coal wool is more robust than the interpretation of DGT. But sometimes the two together can be useful as well. How's that for sitting on a fence?
Yeah. Questions from the audience? Kelly?
Yeah, I've got a question, Rob. It's a little bit preloaded. I think I mentioned this one to you in conversation, but some growers took off some really good yields and still achieved really good protein, even though their nitrogen inputs mightn't have married up and their soil test suggested there wasn't a lot in the bank. How much of that can we attribute to the spring mineralisation, and what sort of range of figures have you seen in that space too?
Yeah, I mean, you have to appreciate that magic potions weren't involved. Hocus pocus, none of it. But, it's a mass balance. So that nitrate might have come from deeper in the profile. Usually 0 to 60 is the soil test that's done. Undoubtedly this year we would have had, or last year there would have been root exploitation down deeper than that, just based on the amount of top growth. I think that mineralisation in a year like that, you're talking about 0.8 to 1 kilogram per hectare of nitrogen mineralised over the 2 months, 3 months of spring. So you're starting to get 100 kilograms of N appearing in mineralisation in that period, let alone any winter mineralisation that might have occurred at a lower rate, half a kilogram. So conceivably, you might have had 100, 130, 150 kilograms of extra N mineralised. You've got some from deeper in the soil. You probably had some in a stubble retention system released by, as it's been mineralised out of the stubble as well. But you know, that's conceivable that sort of values will match up. I think you're talking about H1, getting H1 wheat with 100 kilograms of urea. So no magic there. It's a bit of soil biology and a bit of deep nitrogen that's been exploited.
Thanks, Rob. The next question, does the immobilisation of N through stubble occur if the stubble is standing or if it's incorporated? So you just made a brief comment before about that, Rob.
It will occur as soon as the stubble gets to the ground. By the time the stubble's been... If the stubble's standing and you sow through it, obviously any nitrogen that's in the straw hasn't yet got into the soil, but eventually that material will get into the soil and get incorporated. So in the short term, it's not immobilised, but in the longer term, and when I'm talking longer term, meaning 2 to 3 to 4 months after seeding, then that will be immobilised. Unless you manage to keep it upright for the whole rest of your life. I don't know.
Thanks, Rob. And another question, could foliar applications be used as starters?
It's sort of a counterintuitive, isn't it? A starter. Certainly foliar N is effective. The main factor with foliar N is you have to have enough canopy to capture the foliar N. If there's no canopy there, really you're just spraying nitrogen on the soil. And I think that's the situation. You know, the concept of N losses through volatilisation, you know, we have been told that, you know, you lose 70% of nitrogen with top-dressed urea. We're pretty certain that actually doesn't occur. It might be 10%, might be 15%, do lose some. But surface applied nitrogen, whether it's liquid, as a foliar, as a proposed foliar, fluid, you know, like UAN or a liquid urea, I think that behaves essentially the same way that granular urea does. And it will be preserved in the surface 4 or 5 centimetres. And sometimes the reason we don't see a response to top-dressed N, whether it's foliar or not, is because it hasn't been washed into the soil.
Thanks, Rob. Are there any further questions before we move on? Is there someone? Herbie?
Yeah, just on back on phosphorus, Rob. Like I've applied per year. I've heard that you might only be using 10% of what's supplied in any given year, and the rest of it's used from the bank. Is that factual or?
Yeah, that's pretty true. And in that long-term phosphorus experiment that we had there, we didn't actually measure the source from the phosphorus bank versus what was from your applied phosphorus, but we're certain that applied phosphorus gives early growth quicker if it's with the seed. The fact that phosphorus is preserved, it's not lost when it's, you know, people talk about 20% utilisation of phosphorus in a year. That 80% isn't lost, it's there. And essentially in most of our soils with low PBIs, where the phosphorus isn't bound up into iron or aluminium or calcium complexes, it's still largely available. You know, in our WIMRA soils with a PBI of about 80 to 100, we would reckon there would be 1 kilogram per year per hectare tied up in that soil process. So the 9 kilograms comes in and out. The 1 kilogram is the sort of soil tax. Different PBIs have different soils have different PBIs and so have different soil taxes.
As far as the plant utilising what it's sown with, is that around that 10%?
It depends on different, but somewhere around 20 to 25%. Yeah. Yeah, it's probably a bit more than 10. But again, it depends on the. Oh God, it's a scientific. Yeah, it depends, doesn't it? But yeah, it does change from soil to soil. And it basically depends on the PBI of the soil.
Thanks, Rob. Are there any further questions? Yes.
Yeah, Rob, if we could, sorry to say here, if we could go back to the denitrification with waterlogging, just interested to hear your thoughts on, how much might have actually been lost, given that, the ambient temperature certainly, didn't hit our summer warmth until at least Christmas Day. Could you talk to that, and perhaps even a little bit on the difference between soil types as well?
Yeah, denitrification is driven by temperature, the amount of nitrate that's present, the amount of organic carbon, and waterlogging, which refers then to soil texture. So a clay soil is likely to denitrify more than a sandy soil, and a clay soil is likely to have more organic matter than a clay soil. So in terms of the amounts, it's conceivable that you could have reset the spring, the autumn, the late winter, early spring mineralisation of 45, 50 kilograms. That could have been reset to zero with the waterlogging events that we had in October, similar to the values that we saw from New South Wales. I have no data on that, but that's my feeling, is that we could have just about reset the nitrogen level after that waterlogging event. So does that mean, what's that mean? Well, luckily we had mineralisation occurring as the soils dried out, and the soils were warm. And fortunately a lot of lentils died and will provide some nitrogen in the cycle later on. So, and beans as well. So.
Got one more question for Rob. Can you explain PBI, Rob?
Oh, of course I can. Yes. PBI is phosphorus buffering index, and it's just a chemistry term for the amount of phosphorus that you apply that is captured by the soil. I think of it like the soil tax on phosphorus. So a PBI of 100 means that you'll probably lose about 1 kilogram of phosphorus per hectare to the soil. And that becomes essentially, in our situation, calcium phosphates, insoluble calcium phosphates. In other places, acid soils, it might become aluminium or iron phosphates. But essentially, think of it as this tax that the soil applies to your phosphorus application. Can I go?
I'm sure Rob's asking to leave, but I'm sure he could take one more question if we had it there while he's happy. But are there any more questions?
I've got
Claire.
an easy one for you. Back near the start, you sort of said about 20 to 30 kilos of N was fixed from the legumes. What was the thing per what, please?
That's 20 to 30 kilograms of N per tonne of biomass. And probably lentils are at the 20 minus level. Beans are probably at the 30 level for N fixation, simply because of the distribution and the activity of the rhizobia where they are. So beans, you pull up a bean plant and it's got huge nodules and very active. Lentils are a bit wimpy. Sorry, Jason. And lentils really don't have as an active fixation process as things like beans. And the good thing about beans is they often fail, so they grow a lot, don't yield a lot, so reserve a lot of N. And essentially that's being a bit facetious, but it's not far from the truth.